I want to start with something that sounds almost too simple, but I think it explains a lot of what people are missing in this entire conversation about Canada's so-called $133 billion defense bank. Most people hear a number like that and immediately think in terms of money sitting somewhere, waiting to be spent. But in geopolitics, especially in the current phase we're entering, money is rarely the real story. The real story is leverage, and even more specifically, who gets to decide how industrial capacity is financed before a single weapon is even produced. Now, I want to be careful here, because what I'm describing is not fully built yet. The Defense, Security, and Resilience Bank, DSRB as it's being called, is still in the proposal and negotiation stage. What we do have confirmed, based on official Canadian and partner statements, is that Canada is leading an initiative to create a multilateral financial institution that could eventually mobilize something in the range of £100 billion, roughly $133 billion USD equivalent, for defense and security-related industrial financing. That part is not speculation. That part is being actively discussed at government level and has been publicly acknowledged by officials involved in the process. But everything beyond that headline figure, how it operates, who fully joins, how voting rights are structured, what qualifies as defense and resilience, that's still fluid. And that fluidity is exactly where the real geopolitical meaning sits. Because if you step back for a moment, what Canada is essentially trying to do here is not build a bank in the traditional sense. It is trying to build a financing layer on top of NATO's industrial base. And that's a very different thing. Now let me explain why that matters. For decades, NATO has been a military alliance built on coordination of force. But what the Ukraine war exposed, very brutally, and I don't think this point is emphasized enough in mainstream coverage, is that coordination of force is meaningless if industrial throughput cannot keep up. Ammunition shortages, delayed procurement cycles, fragmented supply chains across Europe and North America, these were not theoretical problems. They became operational constraints in real time. And this is where the Canadian proposal becomes interesting. Because instead of only asking, how do we spend more on defense, it quietly shifts the question toward, how do we finance production capacity at scale across multiple allied economies in a way that reduces friction for suppliers? That sounds technical, but it changes everything underneath. Now, officially, what Canadian officials and partners have been careful to say is that this institution would support defense, security, and broader resilience projects. That wording matters. Resilience is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. It expands the scope beyond tanks and missiles into industrial infrastructure, supply chains, dual-use technologies, and potentially even energy and logistics systems that support military readiness indirectly. And I want to pause on something here that deserves more attention than it's getting. This is not just about increasing budgets. It's about lowering the cost of capital for defense-related industry. Because if you can reduce financing costs for factories, suppliers, and mid-tier defense manufacturers, you are effectively increasing production capacity without necessarily increasing headline defense budgets in the same proportion. That is a structural shift, not a marginal one. Now, here's where things get more politically sensitive. And I want to be very precise with what is confirmed versus what is interpretation. Confirmed. Canada is leading discussions with multiple countries. Reports suggest around 18 participating in talks, with hopes of announcing around 10 founding members at a NATO summit. Luxembourg has been publicly mentioned among early supporters, and other states are engaged in varying levels of consultation. These are based on reporting from established outlets and official briefings. Not confirmed. Final membership list, binding commitments, or operational structure. But even at this early stage, the political intent is revealing. Because Canada is not acting alone in a vacuum here. This is happening in parallel with a broader shift inside NATO countries, where defense is increasingly being treated not just as a military issue, but as an industrial policy problem. And I think this is where a lot of commentary online gets it slightly wrong. There's a growing narrative that this is somehow about NATO preparing for immediate large-scale war. I don't think that's supported by the evidence. What is supported is something more structural and less dramatic, a recognition that modern deterrence depends on sustained industrial output, not just stockpiles. And those are not the same thing. Stockpiles are what you start with. Industrial output is what determines how long you can continue. Now, I also want to challenge a framing I've seen in some Western commentary that presents initiatives like this as evidence of fragmentation from the United States. That interpretation feels too linear to me, because if you look at how NATO has actually evolved over the last decade, what you see is not fragmentation, but layering. New institutions, new financing mechanisms, new coordination structures are being added on top of existing alliances, not replacing them. And there's a reason for that. The United States remains central to NATO's military structure. That hasn't changed. But allied countries are increasingly trying to reduce single points of dependency in industrial production. That is a different logic from political distancing. So when I see commentary saying this is Europe and Canada moving away from the US-led order, I think that's an overreach. A more accurate framing is that allies are trying to build redundancy into the system while still operating within it. And redundancy, in military-industrial terms, is not rebellion. It's risk management. Now, there's one more layer here that I think most coverage underestimates, and it's the financial architecture itself. Because a defense bank is not just about lending money. It's about determining what kind of projects become financially viable at scale. And that includes things that don't look like weapons at first glance. Critical minerals processing, semiconductor supply chains, logistics infrastructure, secure communications networks. In other words, the line between economic policy and defense policy is getting thinner. And once you accept that, the question stops being, why is Canada building a defense bank? And becomes something closer to, why is allied industrial strategy being restructured through financial institutions rather than traditional procurement systems? And I don't think there is a simple answer to that yet. But I do think we're only seeing the early stage of whatever this becomes. And I'll stop here for now, because the next layer is where it gets more geopolitically explicit, especially when you start looking at how Europe, the US, and Asia each benefit or lose influence depending on how this financing model actually gets built. Now, if I take this forward, the next thing I keep coming back to is that this isn't really a Canada story in the way the headline makes it feel. Canada is the architect in this case, yes, but the demand for something like this is actually coming from structural stress inside NATO itself. And I want to be careful here, because it's very easy to overstate unity or overstate crisis, depending on what narrative you prefer. The reality is more uncomfortable and more interesting. The system is functioning, but it is functioning with friction that didn't matter much 20 years ago and now matters constantly. Let's separate what we actually know first. NATO countries, particularly after the Ukraine war escalated in 2022, have repeatedly acknowledged shortages in ammunition stockpiles, long procurement timelines, and fragmented industrial capacity across Europe. That is confirmed in multiple defense ministry statements and allied summit communications over the last few years. The language is not dramatic, but it is consistent. Production capacity is not keeping pace with strategic expectations. Now, where reporting and interpretation diverge is in what that means politically. Some analysts frame it as Europe waking up to a post-American security reality. Others frame it as a temporary adjustment to wartime demand. I think both are slightly incomplete. What's actually happening is more technical and more persistent. NATO is discovering that it is not a single industrial system. It is a collection of overlapping national systems that were never fully integrated for sustained high-intensity production. And that gap between alliance coordination and industrial fragmentation is exactly where something like the Defense, Security, and Resilience Bank becomes relevant. Because what a structure like this does, if it works as intended, is not just provide funding. It reduces coordination friction. It potentially standardizes risk assessment. It creates a shared financial mechanism where multiple countries can jointly underwrite production capacity that no single country is willing or able to fully finance alone. Now, I want to pause on a detail here that is often missed in mainstream coverage. The figure, $133 billion equivalent financing capacity, sounds enormous, and it is, but it should not be interpreted as a single pool of money waiting to be deployed. In practical terms, what is being discussed is closer to a leveraged balance sheet model, similar in concept to other multilateral development banks. That means relatively small amounts of paid-in capital can support much larger lending capacity over time, depending on credit ratings and market confidence. And that immediately brings us to something more important than the headline number: credibility. Because this entire model only works if markets believe the institution will be repaid reliably enough to maintain a strong credit profile. If that credibility is high, borrowing costs stay low, and the bank becomes an attractive channel for industrial financing. If credibility is weak, the entire structure becomes politically symbolic rather than economically meaningful. This is where I think some of the excitement in early commentary may be slightly ahead of reality. Not because the idea is weak, but because multilateral financial institutions take time, sometimes years, to move from announcement to effective operational impact. The World Bank didn't become influential overnight. The European Investment Bank didn't either. These are slow-burn structures. Now, geopolitically, there is another layer that sits underneath this, and it's the question of industrial sovereignty inside alliances. On the surface, NATO is an alliance, but inside that alliance, countries still compete for industrial advantage. They compete for defense contracts, for factory placement, for jobs tied to procurement programs, and for technological spillovers. That competition doesn't disappear just because financing becomes shared. If anything, it becomes more formalized. So here's the tension I keep noticing. A multinational defense financing bank is meant to reduce fragmentation, but it can also amplify competition over where funded projects physically land. And that matters politically. Because if country A gets a major ammunition plant financed through this structure, while country B doesn't, even though both contributed capital or political support, that creates internal pressure inside the alliance. Not necessarily conflict, but negotiation pressure. And over time, that shapes voting structures, governance rules, and eligibility criteria in ways that are not purely economic. This is why governance design is not a secondary detail. It is the core political battleground of this entire idea. Now, I also want to address something I think is slightly overstated in some Western commentary, particularly the idea that this is primarily about reducing dependence on the United States. There is no credible evidence in official statements that Canada or participating partners are attempting to structurally bypass the U.S. in defense financing. In fact, U.S. participation, even if not always central in public narrative, remains implicit in NATO's industrial ecosystem. The U.S. defense industrial base is still the largest single contributor to NATO capability. What is more accurate to say is something narrower. Allied countries are trying to build parallel capacity so that bottlenecks in one system do not freeze the entire alliance's production cycle. That is a resilience argument, not a replacement argument. But, and this is where nuance matters, that resilience logic does have second-order effects. Because if more production capacity is financed and distributed across multiple allied countries, the relative industrial weight of individual states shifts over time. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but gradually. And gradual shifts are often more geopolitically significant than sudden ones because they are harder to reverse. There is also a financial dimension here that deserves more attention than it usually gets. Most discussions about defense focus on budgets, 2% of GDP, 3% of GDP, spending targets, procurement plans. But what actually constrains defense production in many cases is not just budget size, but timing and financing structure. Defense suppliers often need upfront capital to expand facilities before government contracts fully materialize over long procurement cycles. If a multilateral bank can smooth that timing gap, essentially bridging the period between industrial expansion and guaranteed long-term contracts, it changes the risk profile of the entire sector. That is not dramatic in a headline sense, but it is structurally important. Now, stepping back, I think it is also worth acknowledging that we are still in the early formation stage of this concept. There are still open questions that do not have clear answers publicly. Who exactly controls final lending decisions? How are geopolitical risks weighted versus commercial viability? What happens when member states disagree on project prioritization? How will private capital interact with public guarantees? And most importantly, will this actually move fast enough to matter in real-world procurement timelines? I don't think anyone can answer those with confidence yet. And anyone claiming otherwise is probably projecting expectations rather than reporting facts. What we can say, based on confirmed reporting and official statements, is that Canada is actively trying to build a shared financing mechanism for defense-related industrial capacity, that multiple countries are engaged in varying levels of participation, and that the strategic motivation being expressed publicly is resilience, industrial scaling, and reduced bottlenecks in allied production. Everything beyond that, actual effectiveness, political cohesion, long-term influence, remains open. And that's where I'll leave this segment, because the next layer is where the conversation stops being about institutions and starts becoming about power distribution inside the alliance itself, especially when you start mapping who benefits most if defense financing becomes centralized in a multilateral structure rather than remaining purely national. What I find myself circling back to at this stage is a fairly uncomfortable idea for a lot of policymakers, and it's that institutions like this don't just distribute money. They redistribute influence, even when nobody explicitly intends them to. Now, to be precise, there is no confirmed public governance model yet for the Defense, Security, and Resilience Bank that would allow us to say exactly how influence will be allocated. That is still under negotiation. But we can still reason from how similar multilateral financial institutions tend to behave once they exist. And that's where the geopolitics becomes more interesting than the press releases. In most development banks or multilateral lending institutions, there is always a balance between two principles: capital contribution and political equality. Some systems lean more toward weighted voting based on financial input. Others try to preserve equal representation to maintain legitimacy among smaller members. Neither system is neutral in practice. Both create winners and losers, just in different ways. So when I look at Canada's attempt to build a structure that could eventually mobilize something in the range of $133 billion in defense-related financing capacity, I don't just see a funding mechanism. I see a potential decision-making platform that could shape which industries expand fastest inside the alliance. And that brings me to a point that I think is underappreciated in most coverage: defense industrial geography. Because where production happens is not just an economic detail. It becomes a strategic variable over time. If financing flows consistently towards certain countries for ammunition production, naval shipbuilding, missile systems, or drone manufacturing, then those countries gradually accumulate not just factories, but expertise, supplier ecosystems, and long-term industrial advantage. This is not immediate. It doesn't happen in one procurement cycle. But over a decade or more, it compounds. And this is where the political sensitivity emerges, because even within allied systems, countries are not indifferent to where strategic industries are located. A financing mechanism that appears neutral on paper can still produce uneven geographic outcomes in practice. Now, I want to separate confirmed information from interpretation again. Confirmed. Canada is leading discussions, multiple countries are engaged, and the proposed institution is framed as supporting defense, security, and resilience financing across allied economies. Those are based on official statements and established reporting, not confirmed. Which specific industries or countries will receive disproportionate benefit once lending begins, because the institution does not yet exist in operational form. But even at this early stage, some governments are clearly positioning themselves to benefit if the structure goes ahead. You can see it in parallel announcements around defense, procurement expansion, industrial policy adjustments, and increased engagement with supply chain security initiatives. And I want to be careful here not to overstate coordination. This is not a single unified strategy being executed by NATO as a monolith. It is more fragmented than that. It is multiple governments responding to a shared set of pressures: Ukraine, supply chain fragility, rising global industrial competition, and uncertainty about long-term production resilience. That's important because it means the DSRB is not the cause of these shifts. It is more likely a symptom of them. Now, there's another layer I think deserves more attention than it's getting in mainstream commentary, and that is the role of private capital in what is traditionally considered military infrastructure. There are indications, based on discussions reported in financial and policy circles, that institutional investors, such as pension funds and large banks, could eventually play a role in co-financing or participating in projects associated with this kind of structure. I want to stress again. The exact mechanism is not finalized, and any detailed claims about implementation should be treated cautiously. But the direction of travel is not surprising if you look at broader trends. Over the past decade, there has been a gradual convergence between public security priorities and private investment portfolios. Energy transition finance is one example. Infrastructure resilience is another. Defense-related industries are increasingly part of that same continuum, even if they remain politically sensitive. And this creates a subtle but important shift. Security becomes partially financialized. Not in the sense that war is being privatized, but in the sense that access to capital becomes one of the constraints shaping strategic capability. That is a different model from the Cold War era, where industrial capacity was often more directly state-driven and less dependent on cross-border financial structures. Now, I also want to challenge a framing that appears quite often in commentary, particularly the idea that initiatives like this represent a break from the existing Western security architecture. I don't see strong evidence for a clean break. What I see instead is incremental layering. NATO remains intact. U.S. leadership and military capability remains significant. Bilateral defense relationships remain dominant in many procurement decisions. What is changing is the addition of financial instruments that sit alongside those structures rather than replacing them. But, and this is important, even additive structures can change system behavior over time. You don't need replacement for transformation. You just need enough additional friction points and enough new incentives that decision-making starts to flow through different channels. And financial institutions are particularly good at doing that quietly because they operate through incentives rather than commands. Now, let me address something I've seen circulating in more speculative commentary, because I think it's worth being explicit about limits here. There are claims that this type of defense financing architecture is being designed as a coordinated geopolitical counterweight to specific states, or that it represents a hidden bloc formation outside of NATO structures. I have not seen verified evidence that supports those claims in official documentation or credible reporting. They are interpretations layered on top of partial information, not confirmed policy objectives. That doesn't mean geopolitical effects won't exist. It means intent and outcome are not the same thing, and we should be careful not to merge them prematurely. At the same time, it would also be naive to ignore that institutions like this inevitably interact with global competition. Even if the stated goal is resilience, the practical effect of strengthening allied industrial capacity is that relative positioning in global defense production shifts. That is simply how industrial systems work. If you increase capacity in one network of states, you change the competitive balance with others, even without explicit confrontation. Now, one of the more under-discussed aspects of this entire proposal is timing, because building a bank is slow. Building defense capacity is also slow. But geopolitical pressure cycles, wars, crises, supply shocks are fast. So there is a structural mismatch between institutional development timelines and security demand timelines. And that raises a question that I don't think has a clear answer yet. Will this kind of financial architecture be able to deliver impact quickly enough to matter during the period of highest pressure? Or will it only become effective after the most acute phase of adjustment has already passed? I don't think we know yet. And that uncertainty matters more than most headlines acknowledge. Because if the answer is too slow, then this becomes a long-term structural reform that affects the next decade of defense production. If the answer is fast enough, then it becomes a near-term accelerator for industrial expansion across multiple allied countries. Those are very different outcomes. And right now, both remain plausible. What we can say with some confidence is that the idea itself reflects a broader shift in how governments are thinking. Defense is no longer being treated purely as procurement of finished military systems. It is increasingly being treated as an ecosystem problem, one that includes finance, industry, supply chains, and long-term capital allocation. And once you start thinking in those terms, a defense bank stops looking unusual and starts looking almost inevitable. But inevitability in geopolitics is always a dangerous assumption, because between concept and execution, there is always politics, and between politics and execution, there is always delay. And that gap is usually where the real story ends up being decided, even if nobody sees it clearly at the beginning.